70,000 men, the most feared cavalry the world had ever seen. The same horsemen who had burned Baghdad to the ground just 2 years earlier, who had drowned the Tigris River in so much blood it ran black for weeks, who had carved an empire stretching from Korea to Poland in a single generation. They were called the Mongols, and in the summer of 1260 they were unstoppable. Against them stood a group of slaves, 7,000 of them. Former boys, kidnapped as children from the steppes of the Caucasus, sold in the markets of Cairo, raised in chains to serve a dying Egyptian dynasty. The world called them Mamluks, a word that literally means owned. By every law of war, every metric of military science, this should have been the easiest victory in Mongol history. They had crushed China, they had erased Persia, they had wiped the Abbasid Caliphate off the face of the earth. A few thousand desert slaves should have been a footnote. On September 3rd, 1260, in a dusty valley in northern Palestine called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, something happened that the Mongol war machine had never experienced. In 53 years of conquest, it lost. Not a tactical setback, not a temporary retreat, a complete annihilation. The general who had marched from Karakorum to the gates of Jerusalem was killed in the dirt. His entire elite force vanished in a single afternoon, and the myth of Mongol invincibility, the psychological weapon that had conquered half the planet without even drawing a sword, shattered forever. In the next few minutes, you are going to witness the most strategically important battle nobody talks about. The day a slave with a bow stopped an empire. The day Western civilization, Cairo, Jerusalem, Mecca, and yes, eventually Rome, was saved by the very people Europe was busy fighting in the Crusades. How does a slave army defeat the descendants of Genghis Khan? How does an empire that conquered everything, from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, lose to a force 1/10 its size? And what hidden weakness, what fatal flaw at the very heart of the Mongol war machine, did one Egyptian general spot that every king in Europe had missed? This isn't just a battle. This is the moment the impossible became real. This is Ain Jalut. To understand the absolute hopelessness of the Mamluk position in 1260, you have to understand the sheer terrifying scale of what the Mongols had just done to the world. In February of that year, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother of the great Khan Kublai, had done the unthinkable. He had taken Baghdad. For 500 years, Baghdad had been the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. It was the city of 1,000 libraries, the home of algebra, the seat of the Caliph, the spiritual successor to the Prophet himself. It was supposed to be eternal. Hulagu took it in 13 days. He executed the Caliph by rolling him in a carpet and trampling him under cavalry hooves. Mongol custom forbade the spilling of royal blood on the ground. The libraries of Baghdad were thrown into the Tigris. Witnesses said the river ran black with ink for weeks, then red with blood for months. Somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people died. Then Hulagu turned west. Aleppo fell in 7 days. Damascus surrendered without a fight. The Crusader states of the Levant, terrified, sent envoys begging for peace. By the summer of 1260, Hulagu's vanguard was sitting on the Mediterranean coast, looking south toward the last unconquered Islamic power on earth, Egypt. And in Cairo, on a throne built from the blood of his own master, sat a man the world wasn't ready for. His name was Qutuz, and he was not supposed to be sultan. Just months earlier, Qutuz had been a regent, a placeholder for a child king. But when the Mongol envoys arrived at the gates of Cairo, carrying Hulagu's surrender demand, the boy sultan had wanted to negotiate. Qutuz did not. He overthrew the child, took the throne for himself, and did something no ruler had survived doing in 50 years. He killed the Mongol envoys. He executed every single one of them. He nailed their severed heads to the gates of Cairo. He sent the message that no sultan, no king, no caliph had ever dared to send. We do not kneel. It was a death sentence. Every kingdom that had ever murdered a Mongol envoy had been wiped from history within 2 years. Khwarezm, the Kievan Rus, the Jin dynasty. Their cities were now ash, their bloodlines extinct. And Hulagu, when the news reached him, allegedly laughed. He had 150,000 men in Syria. Cairo was a corpse waiting to be buried. But then, and this is the moment that changed everything, something happened 10,000 miles away that no one in the Middle East yet knew about. The great Khan Möngke died in a remote part of China, fighting a campaign Hulagu had no part in. The supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire dropped dead from dysentery. And under Mongol law, every prince of the blood had to return to Karakorum for the election of a successor, including Hulagu. He took most of his army with him. He left behind a force of around 20,000 under his most trusted general, a Nestorian Christian commander named Kitbuqa, a brilliant tactician, a veteran of 40 campaigns, a man who had never lost a battle in his life. And Kitbuqa made one mistake. He assumed the Mamluks would still be terrified. He was about to find out he was wrong. Now look at the men Qutuz was about to lead. The Mamluks were not an army, not in any sense Europe or Asia would have recognized. They were a slave caste, boys taken from the Kipchak, Turkish tribes of the Russian steppe. The very same steppes the Mongols themselves had come from. Sold as children, converted to Islam, raised inside fortified barracks with one purpose: to be the perfect cavalry. They trained with the bow from age 7. They were taught to shoot from horseback at full gallop, hitting targets at 150 yards. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to own property, forbidden to know any life outside of war. By the time a Mamluk was 20 years old, he was, pound for pound, the most lethal mounted soldier on the planet. There was just one problem. The Mongols had invented this style of warfare. The horse archer feigned retreat, the encirclement, the rain of arrows that broke an enemy before the swords even drew. These were Mongol tactics. The Mamluks had spent their whole lives training to fight in a style designed by the very army now marching to destroy them. It was like a student preparing to murder the teacher. And Qutuz had one more piece on the board. A man whose name would echo through Islamic history for 1,000 years, Baibars. A Mamluk general, a former slave, a man with one functioning eye and a soul forged in pure violence. Baibars had personally defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Laforbi 16 years earlier. He hated Qutuz. The two men had been bitter rivals for years. But Baibars hated the Mongols more. And when Qutuz offered him command of the vanguard, Baibars accepted with one silent condition that would matter very much later. After this war ended, only one of them would walk out of the desert alive. But that was a problem for September. In August, they had an empire to kill. Qutuz did something that no Islamic ruler had attempted in 50 years. He left Cairo, he marched north, into Palestine, into the teeth of the Mongol war machine. It was suicidal. By every conventional measure, he should have stayed behind the walls of Cairo and let the Mongols come to him. Let them stretch their supply lines, exhaust their horses, bake in the Egyptian summer. Every general in the Sultan's council told him this. Qutuz refused, because he had realized something that Kitbuqa, in all his brilliance, had missed. The Mongols had one weakness, one single fatal flaw that no enemy in 5 decades of conquest had ever exploited. They needed grass. A Mongol army was not a column of men. It was a tide of horses. Each warrior rode with 3 to 5 mounts, swapping them throughout the day to maintain superhuman mobility. That mobility was the entire foundation of their empire. But those horses ate, constantly. A single Mongol army required pasture land the size of a small country just to stay alive. And in the summer of 1260, the pastures of northern Palestine were dying. Qutuz didn't need to defeat the Mongols. He needed to force them into a battle on a specific piece of ground before their horses starved. He needed to bait Kitbuqa into a fight. Kitbuqa thought he was choosing. He needed Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. A narrow valley in the Jezreel plain, hills on both sides, a water source at the southern end. Open ground in the middle, just wide enough for cavalry, but not wide enough for Mongol encirclement tactics. It was the one place in the entire Levant where Mongol mobility would mean nothing. Qutuz sent Baibars ahead with a small vanguard, a few thousand men, just enough to look like a desperate scouting force. Their orders were simple: find the Mongols, get their attention, run. It was, in essence, the same trick the Mongols had used to destroy the Russian princes at the Kalka River. The same trick they had used against the Hungarians at Mohi. The feigned retreat, the bait, the killing ground waiting at the end of the chase. Qutuz was about to use the Mongols' own playbook against them. Baibars found Kitbuqa's vanguard in late August. The Mongols, true to their nature, charged immediately. Baibars' men turned and ran, but not in chaos. In a measured, professional retreat designed to look like panic. They drew Kitbuqa south, deeper into Palestine, away from his supply lines, away from his fallback positions, into a narrow valley, where the morning sun would rise directly into Mongol eyes. When Kitbuqa entered the valley of Ain Jalut on the morning of September 3rd, he saw exactly what he expected to see. A small, exhausted, terrified Mamluk force drawn up on the southern end, backs against the spring, nowhere to run. He did not see the rest of the Mamluk army hidden in the hills, because Qutuz had been there for 3 days. He had divided his force into 3 wings. two hidden in the high ground on either flank. The center under Baibars, waiting in the valley floor as live bait, and himself, with the reserve, concealed behind the southern ridge. Kitbuqa charged. The Mongol heavy cavalry came down the valley in the formation that had broken Persian armies, Russian armies, Chinese armies, a thundering wedge of horse and steel designed to shatter an enemy line in a single impact. Baibars' men held. Just barely, just long enough. And then the Mamluk flanks came down from the hills. Imagine being a Mongol warrior in the front rank. You have just punched through the enemy center. Victory is moments away. You can taste it. The enemy is broken. And then you hear something you have never heard in your entire career. The sound of arrows hitting your own flanks. Thousands of them. From men you didn't know existed. Men using your own tactics against you. For the first time in 53 years, the Mongol war machine was the one being encircled. Kitbuqa was a brilliant commander. In the chaos, he tried to rally, tried to break out east, tried to wheel his cavalry, tried every counter-maneuver the steppe had ever taught. Each one failed. The terrain was wrong. The pasture behind him had no exit. The Mamluk archers, raised from boyhood in this exact style of war, matched every Mongol shot with two of their own. And then Qutuz did something the chroniclers would write about for centuries. He took off his helmet. His own men were beginning to waver. The Mongol resistance, even in defeat, was savage. Some Mamluk units broke. Qutuz rode to the front of the wavering line, threw his helmet to the ground so every soldier could see his face, and screamed a single phrase that became immortal. Wa Islama! Oh my Islam! He charged into the Mongol center alone. He was the Sultan of Egypt, the most valuable target on the battlefield, and he rode directly into the heart of the dying Mongol army with no helmet on his head, daring his men to follow him or watch him die. They followed. By midday, the Mongol formation had collapsed. Kitbuqa, refusing to flee, was unhorsed and captured. They dragged him before Qutuz, still in chains. History records his last words. Kitbuqa, who had served the Mongol Khans his entire life, looked Qutuz in the face and said, "I have killed many of you. I do not regret it. But know this, when news of my death reaches Hulagu, the hooves of his horses will shake the earth from Egypt to the gates of your tomb." Qutuz had him beheaded on the spot. By sunset, every Mongol in the valley was dead, not retreating, not captured, dead. The Mamluks took almost no prisoners. They wanted the message to be absolute. The myth was broken. In the weeks that followed, news of Ain Jalut spread through the Islamic world, faster than any messenger could carry it. Damascus, which had surrendered to the Mongols just months earlier, rose up and slaughtered its Mongol garrison. Aleppo did the same. Within 60 days, every inch of territory Hulagu had conquered in Syria was back in Muslim hands. And in Karakorum, when Hulagu finally received the news, he did not laugh. He went into a black, screaming rage that lasted 3 weeks. He swore to return with 500,000 men and burn Cairo to the foundations. He never did. The civil war for the throne of the great Khan consumed the next decade of his life. By the time the Mongol Empire stabilized, the Mamluks had built a fortress system across Syria, so dense, so professionally garrisoned, that the Mongols would spend the next 60 years throwing armies against it and breaking against the walls. They never took Cairo. They never took Jerusalem. They never reached the Mediterranean coast in force again. The high tide of the Mongol Empire had been reached in a dusty valley in Palestine on a September afternoon against an army of slaves. But here is the part that almost no one in the West understands. Ain Jalut did not just save Egypt, it saved Europe. In 1260, the Crusader states of the Levant were starving, surrounded, and one bad season from collapse. Hulagu had been preparing to roll west, into Antioch, into Tripoli, into the Mediterranean. From there, his fleet would have crossed into Sicily, into southern Italy, into a fragmented, plague-weakened Europe that could not have stopped him. The Pope, when he heard of Hulagu's advance, had genuinely considered negotiating an alliance with the Mongols against Islam. He did not understand that the Mongols saw Christians and Muslims the same way, as future subjects, or future corpses. When Ain Jalut shattered the Western Mongol army, it did not just kill 20,000 horsemen. It killed the entire strategic possibility of a Mongol invasion of the Mediterranean. Italy never burned. Rome never fell. The institutions that would, 2 centuries later, give birth to the Renaissance were preserved by a battle they would never even hear about. And here is the final, terrible irony. Baibars, the one-eyed general who had baited the trap that destroyed Kitbuqa, rode back to Cairo with Qutuz at the head of the victorious army. The two men were heroes, saviors of Islam, the most celebrated commanders in the Muslim world. Halfway home, in the desert, Baibars approached the Sultan during a hunt. He asked for a single favor, the gift of a Mongol slave girl captured at Ain Jalut. Qutuz, in the warmth of victory, granted it instantly. Baibars knelt to kiss the Sultan's hand in gratitude, and then he buried a dagger in Qutuz's throat. 47 days after the greatest victory in Islamic military history, the man who had saved civilization died in the sand, at the hands of the man who had baited his trap. Baibars rode back to Cairo, declared himself Sultan, and ruled for 17 years. He would build the Mamluk dynasty into the greatest power in the medieval Mediterranean. History does not reward the saviors, it rewards the survivors. Skanderbeg held back the Ottomans. Charles Martel held back the Umayyads. But 200 years before either of them, an Egyptian slave army held back the apocalypse. And the only reward their sultan received was a knife in the dark from his own best general. That is the kind of irony history doesn't plan, and doesn't need to. Subscribe, because in our next video, we are going to break down the most strategically devastating betrayal in military history. The moment a brother killed a brother and changed the fate of 3 civilizations in a single night. You won't believe who pulled the trigger. We'll see you there.